Okay, let me make sure that we're live. What I was trying to do was, yeah, okay, so we are now live. The problem that we're having is it's got the wrong title, so I'm going to fix that real quick, and then I will share it. But Gary, what happened was that we missed your whole thing on Mesoamerica,
Oh, okay.
and I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
But we are live.
Do
So
you
if
have a
you
new
want to go
link
back to
for
it,
the?
I will. I'm getting it right now.
All right.
I have to say it's not made for kids before I can save it. But yes, we are live, so I have a new link and I'm going to drop it as soon as I can save this. Ah, Lucy's here, so she found us. Oh my gosh. I'm trying. I'm trying here. There we go. New link coming at ya. All right, well, we're back on. So apologies to everybody. I prayed again about this. I thought it was my VPN. And we are having to restart with just a whole new stream. And so thank you for patience, everybody. I thank you, Gary, for your patience. Thank you, NPC, for your patience. And I apologize that we keep having to do this, whatever it is that's happening. But here we are. We're on part 2, take 2, and we are in fact live. And we missed what you said about the Mesoamerican stuff. Now, you two didn't miss it, but I missed it and the chat missed it. So I apologize. Do you mind just going through that one more time, Gary?
Sure. Do you want to pose the question again?
I don't have it in front of me anymore, but we're talking about the royals, and what she asked was that did that royalty and bloodline you were talking
Yep.
about include Mesoamericans?
Yeah, and I thought it was an extraordinary answer. I don't know whether I can reduplicate it, but I'll try. Just kidding.
Darn it.
It was so brilliant. That's why it disappeared. So yeah, it's you can look at the Mesoamerican, First Nation, or South American with the Incas as being in the same organizational structure, the same bloodline structure as what happened elsewhere in the world. It goes back to the same understanding of back to an original set of people after the flood and specific gods after the flood. So Quetzalcoatl would be the most common known name, but there's several other names that are part of it. And every one of the First Nations in North, South, and Central America, they have different names, but they're talking about the same kind of gods. And so they also receive the same divine right to rule as being from that bloodline. And even in some of the writings that you get out of Chichen Itza and other of the Mesoamerican city-states that are on some of the stone monuments and cities, is they're talking about that bloodline of kings. And it's the same concept. So when we look at what's going on in the First Nations in North America, is just to sort of, kind of double tap it, is that all of the chiefs, they tend to be succeeded by bloodline chiefs. And same with the religious organizational structure, whether it's in the First Nations in North America or Mesoamerica, the priest class is an akin sort of bloodline of that comes from the gods as well. And it's the same caste system that was in place. That's the same feudal system that we had around the world, with basically the 4 different levels of hierarchy in the society. And that is maintained even to this day in First Nation culture. There are some elected bands and chiefs now, but still there's a heavily weighted bloodline set that's in there as well. So this is a phenomena that is all around the world, and it's not coincidental. It was all reset up again after the flood. So that's why it's important to sort of understand our common history around the world and then try and figure out what that means in terms of what's being not told to us and how that affects us today and how that's going to affect, particularly from a Christian perspective, end-time prophecy.
I think that was just as great of an answer as the last time, so we're even better, probably. NPC, you had some questions, I believe, that we didn't get to yet.
Well, just to add to that, what he was talking about there, the structure, even in Jewish peoples, they had the Levites themselves, which were set apart as well. So they kind of, I think you're right, that seems to be like the formula of sorts that they try to repeat. They try to repeat what God did. They create their own cultures, their own principality, or their own kingdom, complete with all the different castes, right? Kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a counterfeit of what God originally set up, beginning with Adam. It was counterfeited from the religious perspective with Cain and Enoch and setting up of mysticism, and that's the same system that crosses the flood. The thing that's a little bit different in the structure is that with the Sethites, is they didn't have kings. It was only the Canaanite line that had kings that were ruling over them, and they were intermarrying with the Nephilim offspring before the flood. And we don't get kings for the descendants of Abraham after the flood until well into Israel's history. And it's interesting what happens then is that the Israelites have been sent deliverers or judges all the time throughout the age of the judges. And what they're looking for is a government that is going to be like the other nations of the world, right? So they already have that bloodline priesthood with the Levites that goes back to Aaron. And now they're looking for dynastic kings. And so Samuel selects King Saul. And what's interesting about King Saul is he is described as a full head and a neck taller than all the other Israelites. And the reason why that ought to resonate as part of the understanding as to concepts. So what they were trying to replace is, or bring in a government that's run over by, or that's governed by the offspring of the fallen angels, and as you go down through history, more the hybrid human Rephaim kings, because they were taller than the average people that they were ruling over. And so that's what I think was part of the appeal to bringing in King Saul.
Yeah, as if they didn't trust in the spirit of Yahweh, and rather they wanted a tangible physical man. But really what they're choosing is the left hand, because it's a giant. He looks like a giant, right? So that's kind of how it seems to me, is they felt like they needed the physical man's protection rather than the spirit.
Yeah, they wanted to be like the rest of the world. They wanted to have a government that was basically answerable to the council of the gods, as Psalm 82 talks about, in Deuteronomy 32. So, and of course, what happens with the monarchy is it becomes corrupt very, very quickly. And at times it's hard to tell the difference between a lot of the kings than kings of other nations. There's some good ones as well, but anytime you get that centralized power, you get that corruption. And so when you look again at how the religious structure was set up in Israel, you had pretty much a flat line hierarchy. Yes, you had a main temple, but you had the high priest of the Sanhedrin. But you didn't have this very sort of army-like sort of setup, and that the temples that were in the other cities, they operated very much on their own, and that remained with the Jerusalem church. Only when it becomes Romanized do we get all of these things in there in terms of that organizational structure and a pope and archbishops and arch this and arch that. Which is, again, more of a polytheist structure that's been replaced. So now you get a very centralized system in that replaced the decentralized system. And it's important to understand that concept as well, because if you look at what happens at Babel, when everything is centralized, you get an Antichrist type figure where you have a universal religion that is imposed on the people of Babel, and then God disperses the languages so that is not going to happen again, that you're going to have decentralized nations all over the world until the time of the end, when you get Babylon, the 10-king empire, that's going to end up with Antichrist. And of course, that is, the same type of apocalyptic thing that went on at the time of Babel. And of course, that's why you have Babel as the root word for Babylon, and the allegory to understand what the whole religious aspect and the government aspect of Babylon in the end time.
So, and we've talked about the dragon Messiah, and so this would relate to how they're trying to combine the kingship and the priestly faculties into one entity that will rule in that end time scenario. Is that kind of how it seems, like a Nimrod of our modern time?
Yeah. So when you looked at, again, that organizational structure, whether or not it's Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar, it doesn't really matter. Anywhere throughout history where you're talking about the nations and polytheism, is the divine representative is also the head of the church, and he is known as something that's called a priest king. That's the language that you get coming down through into modern history as the Fisher King, as it comes up in the Grail tales. So in their belief system, Cain, where it sort of roots back to, was a priest king as well, in that the whole dynastic succession are these priest kings or Fisher kings, as they're known in the allegory today, that controlled both. And then ultimately the dragon Messiah is going to be that priest king representing Satan, the serpent, the dragon, on the throne, just as the seraphim angels are the pantheon. So whether or not you want to transfer that sort of to as part of the meaning of the Watchers, as well as part of that dragon Messiah that unites that pantheon of gods under that rule, you have the same sort of meaning to it. So I think I'm thinking that's what you're talking about. But it's interesting how that centralization happens, and that's when ultimate corruption and destruction come about.
Well, that might pivot really well into one of the other questions I did have. We may have mentioned this in the past, but the Fomorians, they were monstrous beings that came from under the sea or the earth. So I wondered if maybe the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth that we see in Revelation could also relate to maybe these giants taking over those king and priestly duties of sorts in that end time scenario. Is that maybe one way to look at it?
Yeah, and it's interesting, on the Fomorians, is that they are the first settlers of Ireland before the Tuatha De Danann settle Ireland, and that they're very much connected back as being spirits, as they, I guess the best way of putting it would be as sort of that whole ideology, comes down through the generations, that they're described as demonic pirates and spirits of the earth. So that's the demonic spirit after those bodies are going to die of these Fomorians, and that they're connected to the word more in Old Irish Gaelic, and that's the word for phantom, which is spirit, banshee, things like that, and muir, which is the sea. And so they have very much this connection to the sea gods like Poseidon and Iapetus in the Greek mythology. And these were, deformed giants that in some line of thought believed, were from the curse of Ham. I'm not really thinking that. I kind of look at, the Fomorians as being a kind of Cyclops or one of the branches. And in Greek history with the Cyclops, you have they're like the original ones are godlike, and again they're created by Gaia and Uranus, just as the Gigantes were that we were talking about earlier. And there's three of them that are like gods. They're not as we would understand the Cyclops, and that was Arges meaning bright, and Brontes meaning thunderer, and Steropes, which was a lightning or lightener. But these three also had offspring with humans. And that's where I think you get the physical forms as we understand them today that are giant with one eyes. And then you've got that connection back to, as I say, the sea gods as well. And as part of the nations, I mean, as part of the Goyim, you have these beast nations that come out of the sea, which is allegorical in biblical prophecy for the Goyim nations of the world, the non-Israelites. And so you have the dragon, the Hydra, the seven-headed giant, or not giant, but beast that comes out of the sea that is representing of the seven beast empires that were governed by Rephaim kings. But all the nations had Rephaim kings and descended Rephaim kings thereafter, but the specific empires had Antichrist type figures that at one time could have presented themselves as an Antichrist figure. And these are the beast kingdoms that rise up out of the sea. And typically you can understand the beast kingdoms as being ones in prophecy that would have a relationship with the nation of Israel and Judah. Israel being the northern kingdom after the split, after the reign of Solomon, and Judea being the southern kingdom. So if you want to look at the seven, who there likely are from the relationship, because they're brought about by the four winds of prophecy, you would look at probably Egypt because as the first one, because that's where Israel became a nation, where the 70 sons of Jacob brought up their nation, and where the number of the nations after the flood are partially counted from, along with the patriarchs that descend from Noah that are listed in the table of nations in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles. And the next nation would be Assyria, because Assyria is a branch out of Babel and Nimrod. And what they do is they actually invade the covenant land. They don't take the southern kingdom at that time. They threaten it, and except for the repentance of the Judeans, they would have been taken into exile as the northern kingdom was. And then the next beast empire is going to be Babylon, and Babylon takes southern Judah into exile. And then the next beast kingdom is Medes and the Persians, and it's the Medes and the Persians that permit the release of Judah and the setting up of and the building of the second temple. And then you have Greece, which has, invades the whole area as well, takes control over Judea, and also creates an abomination-like event in the temple. And then you have the Romans, who are going to create the diaspora of visible Judah that still exists to this day. So the Beast Empire, when it comes back, it's going to be dealing specifically for the prophetic end time and the prophetic fulfillment of Israel's destiny in the time of the awakening of Israel and in Judah as we see them visibly today. And part of that is going to be the covenant that Judea is going to sign, where they can be protected by this empire, the beast empire of the 10 kings of the end time, that's negotiated by Antichrist, sponsored by Babylon, the universal religion. And they're going to be able to start doing their sacrifices that are listed in the Torah again in the temple, only on a wing or an extremity or an overspreading of the temple, as depending on which translation in English that you're reading for that language in the book of Daniel. So that is, when you take that back to the understanding of what the beasts are, these are the spiritual beasts, and that the spirit of the Antichrist has been around forever. So Fomorians may not be as much, they did intermarry with the Tuatha De Danann and were amongst other people afterwards, as in the Furbolgs and the Nabetians, which are basically the same people, and have a history with them, but they're part of these beast creatures that are loyal to the fallen angels that are ruling and enslaving humankind throughout history. So I know that's a bit of a long rant about the Cyclops, but it's sort of a fascinating thing that you don't get a lot of information on. But they are a kind of Nephilim creature for sure, just a little bit distinct.
That's really fascinating that you mentioned their association with the Cyclopses and the one eye symbolism, because in the Bible it tells us in Zechariah 11, one of the marks of an idol shepherd was that they'd have their right eye darkened. So they were in a sense Cyclops at that point.
Well, and what's really interesting about that is that these offspring Cyclops, while still in Greece, because the Fomorians actually migrate, and they're classified as Scythians or Tuatha De Danann ones, after the flood. But there's a group of them that are related in some Greek mythology with Polyphemus, one of the groups of the Cyclops. But these individuals are referred to as uncivilized shepherds, and that's the brethren of Polyphemus.
I'm glad you brought up that.
Yeah, NPC has said very similar things. We just recently, I was going to say, you've been talking about this as well as the Cyclops, but go ahead.
Yeah, the entire concept of a shepherd king, and that there's like this, like you were talking about earlier, this priestly kingship type duty that comes about every now and then, and these shepherds, they rise up and lead people either into captivity or into salvation, etc. So it's quite an interesting concept.
Yeah. Well, the other shepherd kings are the Hyksos.
Oh, okay.
Right. And the Hyksos, and I write in my book all about the Hyksos and put in place where they fit into Israelite history and who they were. There was, when I was talking about the three kinds of names that you might hear in Semitic or in Egyptian, naming of these people that are smaller than the Rephaim but taller than average humans. They were 7 to 9 to 10 feet tall on average. The Hyksos are part of these people. They come out of the Aryans out of the north, and you have the Shamau and the Amau that are connected to the Aryans that are connected to the Hyksos. And the Hyksos, when they took over as the Pharaoh kings, these were the shepherd kings, and they, dominated a lot of Canaan and had places, fortresses set up in places like Jericho and things like that. And then they escaped back to parts of the covenant land into Jerusalem and Jericho and other parts after their run out of Egypt. And so you look at the timing on that, and you look at the time of Jericho, and they're probably the ones who refortified Jericho to have those huge walls that, are talked about, a couple hundred years later when Israel takes the land of the covenant. So you have this intermixing, I guess is what I'm saying, of all of this Aryan sort of mythology. And also the Aryans were also part of the Philistines from Crete, as the Philistines intermixed with the Cherathim and the Pelathim that all come from Crete. And these are the same Aryans, Indo-Aryans that are the Rephaim, and these are the same ones that are living amongst the Cyclops after the flood, whom the Fomorians migrate from over to Ireland. I know that was a long way of getting about it, but everything is just sort of interconnected the more you dig back.
Well, one of the reasons for that is because they were known as seafaring, right? So they traveled around a lot more than folks that just kind of focused on agriculture, so to speak, right?
Yeah, as did, and you wonder as to the connections to the people of Tyre and the Sidonians, and that one would think that they would have a connection through intermarriage with the Aryans, who were those seafaring people, because they set up, it's pretty much a beast empire. It's not listed in prophecy as one of the beast empires, but when you're looking at some of the Ezekiel prophecies, and they're talking about the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28 and in a couple other prophecies, this was a beast empire, and they were also seafarers, but they're just not part of the seven, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That's fascinating. And I have a link up here about the Hyksos, and discusses Lord of Shepherds, captive kings, shepherd kings, foreign kings. It's just, I'm going to have to get into this. This is such an interesting topic. But
you're gonna love that part in my book.
It shows the crook and the crown here,
yep,
as their symbols. So could we maybe talk about, I mentioned Jack and the Beanstalk, since we're kind of in the Ireland, area. This is in that, the British Isles, right, is where this comes out of. Hello?
Yep, no, I just wasn't sure whether you were finished there or not. I didn't want to interrupt you. Yeah, so you get a very strong tradition in Irish with the Tuatha De Danann, and that overflow into England with giants. And also you have giants like Albion, Gog and Magog as being giants there as well, and many, many other ones. But those are some of the more famous ones. And so Gog, Magog, and Albion were the offspring of Iapetus, which was one of the parent gods that Poseidon would have moved up and taken over after Iapetus went to the abyss. And so Poseidon would be a god that's after the flood, but sort of takes the history and the legacy of Poseidon with the title. I mean, of Iapetus with the title. So what's interesting, sort of, about that is that,
man, this is wild,
isn't it? You get Gog and Magog that show up in the Bible, right? So, and the descendants of Japheth, they settled with these Scythians after the flood. And I think they took on the names of Gog and Magog and other names of giants. And Gog isn't in the patriarchal listings of nations, but Gog comes up in the New Testament and in Ezekiel 38 and 39 of Gog of Magog. And Gog is this, as you take that back to its meaning in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, is this allegory for a end-time Antichrist figure. So now let's sort of get back on track in terms of what you're asking about in terms of Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack is this figure that is in Halloween, a Tuatha De Danann individual, a hero individual, and that's where the word jack-o'-lantern comes from. And he's in this contest in mythology with the devil. We won't go into a Halloween show tonight, but he is a typical evil spirit after he dies. And we talked about this a little bit, earlier, and again with about the Fomorians. And so you have that sort of in that same kind of tradition. And Jack is known as a spirit as well. So like if you see words like Jack and the, not Jack and the Beanstalk, that's what we're talking about, Jack in the Box, that's like one of these demonic spirits coming out of this chest or this ark to scare people, which is an allegory for what it really means. But that's another rabbit hole. Or when you have, I'm trying to remember. It doesn't matter. There's lots of, when you see Jack that's related to some of these kinds of fairy tales, understand that they're referring to this hero type of figure that is related to giants. And in Jack and the Beanstalk, he isn't the actual giant. He's actually the one that is climbing the tree or the beanstalk up into the clouds. And that's an allegory for the world tree, right? It connects heaven and earth. And typically you get an understanding coming out of prehistory and the allegory of it. You have the titans of heaven and the titans of earth, which are the offspring. They're the heroes. So a classic example of that would be Atlas, who's the offspring of Poseidon, who's called both a hero and a titan. You've heard of the Anunnaki of heaven and the Anunnaki of earth. Again, the gods of the heaven and the offspring, just as we talked about with the Nephilim and the Nephilim in the first part of the show. So I'm not quite sure what they're trying to do in the Jack of the Beanstalk. So they could be trying to do two different allegories on there, because you have these giants who like to eat humans. Well, that was a typical trait of the giants. But you also had sacrifices of humans to the gods as well. And then the famous line, if I can remember out of my childhood, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, or something to that effect. Again, these blood rituals to the gods, and or the giants drinking blood so that they could retain or get back, is a better way of saying it, get back their immortality that was taken away in Genesis 6:3, which is there for a reason, because it's in the 4 verses for the creation of the giants, that they want to get that immortality back by drinking the life out of humans and to increase their cognitive abilities, to make them brighter, smarter, and can talk more directly with their with the fallen angels, their gods, and be more like them, is what they're trying to do. So you get these fairy tales that are, part of the Tuatha De Danann as the fairy people, and fairy being the bloodlines, the matriarchal bloodlines of the giants, as opposed to the dragon bloodlines as being the patriarchal bloodline. Just as you have coming together, I know I'm on a number of different tracks here, but just as you have coming together with King Arthur and Guinevere, who are part of the Grail stories, they are Tuatha De Danann descendants, and they represent as divine representatives on earth as the mother goddess and the god as the king and the queen. Guinevere actually goes back in Irish to me basically meaning a spirit and a banshee and sort of words like that, and she's the fairy queen. That's her allegory. And fairy queens were that matriarchal bloodline, and King Arthur is the son of, guess who? Uther Pendragon. So King Arthur is a Pendragon as well. So again, you have that sort of allegories that are overlaid that run through the fairy tales. So the fairy tales are stories that are read to children that teaches them about the belief system, the religion, and the genealogies of the giants.
Man, we had a question in the chat, so before we got too far from that topic, I wanted to, from Chris D. Gary, do you think Tarshish is the biblical reference to Atlantis? Verses describe its ships being destroyed by a wind, laid waste, it being an island ruled by kings, being rich in the Western Mediterranean?
Well, I lead off the chapter in my book on Atlantis with that verse in Isaiah. And so, yes, there's definitely connections there. And I think that prophecy in Isaiah is one of a number of prophecies that I like to call dual prophecies. And a dual prophecy, and to give a couple other examples of what I mean by dual prophecy, Isaiah 14, parts of 13 as well in it, Ezekiel 28, and several other ones are what I call dual prophecies. And dual prophecies have information that is provided to us about prehistory so that we can understand the context. Then you have it as a prophecy given by one of the prophets. In this case, it's Isaiah, who lived in the time, of the Syrian apocalypse that is about to come. And it's a prophecy about the king of Syria that's going to be coming in, that's going to exile Israel. And so it's a prophecy for that period of time. And it's also a prophecy for the end time. And that it has things that are going to happen in there, just like you have, the fall of the Assyrian in the end time on the mountains of Israel, and you have the passage in there about the serpent's root and the seraphim type beings that are connected to the serpent's root, and you also have in there the passages about Satan and what he tried to do into prehistory. And so you get this understanding coming out of this prophecy that the Assyrian king is one of these beast kings that are going to come about that are interrelated with Israel. And he's going to try and raise his throne into heaven like Nimrod did and like Satan did. And that the end time Antichrist is going to do the same thing. So when we look at Isaiah 23, as I recall, you have this place that's called an island, right? And, Tyre wasn't an island, but it's destroyed by the sea. It wasn't destroyed by the sea. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And so you have aspects that are accurate for the time, and then you have parts that are an understanding of prehistory. And when it's destroyed by the flood, I look at that as by the sea, I look at that as the flood in that. And that these are the people that sent survivors around the world, which is an interesting sort of thought. And I'm not quite sure at times whether that's physical or it's allegorical. But yeah, I think that is representing Atlantis. And it's not only representing Atlantis, but as the city of Tyre, it was, that beast king that I was talking about in terms of the Phoenicians, and that, they had an empire that went around the sea, a seafaring sort of empire, and they were very much into trade. And so this is also an allegory for end time Babylon, because part of what Babylon is a city that controls all of the commerce, as Revelation 18 talks about. And so you have a few different allegories that come out of the prophecies in the Old Testament about Babylon city that's said to be a city 4 or 9 times between Revelation 14, 17, and 18. So we know it's a city. We know it has some commerce. We also know it's the city of blood in the end time. And so that brings into another city that is used in that sort of dual prophecy perspective called Nineveh, and again of the Assyrians. And so you also have Babel City, which is also Babylon, which is the other city that's used to the allegory that is going to use in its allegory between Babel and Babylon to be this sort of regal, wealthy religion of the end time, and to be this universal religion. And so Yeah, I find Isaiah 23 to be a very, very interesting prophecy. And so, yeah, it's in the, I think it's chapter 17 of my book is the Atlantis chapter. And I lead off with that and I talk a little bit about this. And then I bring that sort of concept forward when we get into chapter 4 and some prophetic implications that roll forward from Atlantis for the end time.
We did have another question from the chat. Sorry, go ahead, NPC. You comment, and then I'll ask the question.
Oh, well, just one thing you said that where you thought maybe it was Nebuchadnezzar or Nimrod that destroyed the island. Maybe that is a beast from the sea of sorts. Maybe that's one way to kind of look at it, because they might have just considered
that's
them
another
all.
way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. They're all part of the same thing. So I mean, if you look at Daniel 2 on the metallic empires, they're all one statue, all one sort of being, just different parts of it, right? And then as you see that in Revelation 13, all 7 empires are part of the same beast. So yeah, that's exactly right, NPC. I mean, that's perfect analogy.
Kind of like a alloy and ally. It was just what it came to mind when you said that. Metal.
Yep. Yep.
You had a question in the chat, Aaron?
Yes, it came from Jackie, and she says, can you elaborate on the garments that Cush passed on to Nimrod?
All the garments from the Garden of Eden?
From the
That's
book of
just all she wrote.
Jasher, I think that sort of comes back on. So if I've got the reference right. So basically you have, if the garments that are being talked about is what I'm thinking is being talked about. When Adam and Eve are in the garden, they're not wearing any clothes, but once they get ostracized, God makes them clothes, as we're told in the Bible. And it comes down through legend in Jewish legend, and also I believe in the book of Jasher, that these clothes are going to be inherited, and that Nimrod actually received those clothes somehow after the flood of Adam and Eve that helped them become strong. And so we don't get that in the Bible, and we're not told how Nimrod, son of Cush, becomes Gibberim-like he becomes a mighty one. Even though he's the offspring of Cush, we're not told how that happens. And that's one sort of, I think, solution to how that occurs. The trouble with the book of Jasher, though, and I don't use them in my book, and I just go right to Jewish legend, is because it has so many mystical corruptions that are in it that it's just a little bit too unreliable for me. I use it for context, and I certainly leave the possibility open that that account could be correct. But I have no way of sort of affirming that biblically.
Yeah, you can't test it back to the vine, in other words, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I see what you're meaning.
Yep, that's the only other question I had from the chat.
That was a really good answer. One thing, we were talking about Gog and Magog earlier. Aren't there some statues in somewhere on the island of the United Kingdom or England where they have these giants displayed like eating people even, and they do these processions with kind of like the Chinese London. Dragon, but with
all around
instead.
London. Yeah. And into Wales, yeah, and they're the protectors, Gog and Magog of London, by the way.
Which have a dragon on their crest, I think, even, right?
Well, yeah, and in this case, it's the red dragon for the most part.
So maybe the Wales, unicorn is one and the red dragon's the other, perhaps?
Yeah, it's interesting, and those are the some of the imageries that you get on the royal coat of arms. And you also get a lion, and you also get eagles and double-headed eagles. And the coat of arms of the royal families is their taciturn communication of their genealogies in terms of where they come from. And in this case, I think mostly they're communicating the gods that they take their genealogies back to. And these coats of arms will change from generation to generation as they would intermarry into other bloodlines. They'll create a new coat of arms that has some differences in the genealogies that would reflect that scioning of that new dynasty or coat of arms. So it's easy to make a reference back from a dragon to a seraphim angel. So people be quite familiar with that if they're familiar with seraphim angels. The lion you could take back to the god Nergal that's talked about in the Bible, which is a lion god, or Mahis of the Egyptian pantheon, or Bast, or and then there's a few other ones there as well, and that they're likely the ones that an angel may have even been called Ariel, which is means the lion of God. And Ariel is thought in polytheism to be a name of one of the fallen angels. And so if a serpentine god produces offspring and they look like them, as in the serpentine facial features like the high cheekbones, the extended cheekbone, the large wraparound glowing eyes, and this elongated skull, one can imagine that their offspring would look like them, like the linemen of Moab, or the Gadites, or all of these lion warrior beings like King Arioch that come out of Mesopotamia in the War of Giants, and Arioch means lion-like. And there's a strong tradition in Mesopotamia of these lion type of Nephilim. And the eagle and or the unicorn tends to be sort of a representation of the cherubim. So if you notice on the cherubim, it's got 4 faces, and one of them is an eagle. So when it takes a human form, it doesn't usually, or a physical form in this universe, it doesn't typically take a 4-headed face. What's most common would be like the Anunnaki that are depicted in Sumeria, or a falcon god like Horus in the Egyptian pantheon. And they're thought to have created offspring as well that look just like them, like the Tengu. People want to Google Tengu, you're going to get these figures that are these bird-faced warriors and priests. And they're the offspring of the bird-like gods. In the Kisha you have the Zabelba, which are owl or raven-faced type of giants that were the offspring of the gods in the Kisha Maya tradition. And they have a branch that's called Camazots, Camazotz. Google that, you're going to bring up a Batman-like outfit, because this was the house of Bat in the Zabelba branches. And the unicorn is a little bit more tricky, because it's thought in some of the occult realms to be a divine-like being, but this is sort of, we don't really get this. And so there's an allegory that is written into the unicorn dynasty of King James, because he has 2 unicorns on his coat of arms. And if you get into Greek mythology, you have these chariots that are pulled by, in some depictions, in horses. But typically, as you take that back to its root, these are cherubim that are pulling it. And it's a counterfeit of the God's chariot, as it's described in the visions in Ezekiel 1 and Ezekiel 10, of the cherubim that are pulling God's throne. And so the unicorn tends to be an allegory for a cherubim. So,
wow.
Yeah. So I think that's what they're communicating in their coat of arms, is their gods that they go back to. And you get other types of beings that are in the coat of arms, but everything that is in there is a cult, and it has a meaning for their specific bloodline.
So if it were indeed a unicorn, which I've heard translated also as wild ox or like reem, then it's as if I've heard this term prime movers, as if the seasons themselves are uh, controlled by the movement of these prime movers through the sky. The myths talk about chariots moving the sun and so on and so forth. Seems to be where that comes from.
Same sort of idea. And so in the King James Version Bible, you are correct. The Hebrew word is rem for a wild bull, and it ought not to be translated as unicorn. But the King James Version Bible was written for the unicorn king and his bloodlines. So that has been inserted there by the translators. And
occulted, if you will.
If you will, yes.
It's been hidden.
And it's kind of hidden. And unicorn is used in some very interesting applications in Genesis, like goring the nations around the world.
I was just about to mention that.
Yeah. And so they're going to usurp that for the Antichrist pedigree if his bloodline were to be able to take power. And he will be the Antichrist type figure. You get the unicorn used with in conjunction with Mount Hermon. I can't remember whether or not it's with Senir or Sion, which are different names listed in the Bible for Mount Hermon. Everywhere unicorn is utilized, it is a term that is used to glorify King James and his bloodline and what he thought he and his destiny was going to be. And of course, he creates the Commonwealth of Nations, right? With the beginning of basically his empire, and with the help of Francis Bacon. Of course, he was also second in charge with Elizabeth before King James came to town from Scotland. But this unicorn understanding is also, if you understand the prophecies as it is written in the book of Daniel, as that single horn that comes up in between, in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 8, that's the unicorn allegory for the Antichrist in the end time.
So it's as if all of these, when we talk about these different angelic ranks or kingdoms, it's as if they've tried to cross all of their bloodlines into one representative, if you will, that becomes this horn or unicorn, right? So like they want to ascend above their station or where they've been placed. And kind of reminded me earlier when you were mentioning about ascending up to heaven and the Poseidon and the Atlantis. It's like, well, that was the marine kingdom. They were not supposed to reign above the water or even on the earth necessarily. And then they even want to go to the heaven. So it's I kind of see these, they're trying to gain social mobility, if you will, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and, if you look at that Atlantean Empire, that was, the Golden Empire. That was the Golden Age. That's where the knowledge and things were really sort of developing. They had some rivals. They were trying to take over the antediluvian world. When the story is told out of Crataeus and Timaeus, as there's more than one king. Most people don't know is that there were 10 kings. And of course, that included, as part of the empire before it was defeated by the Greeks, they had land and kings that were reigning over North Africa. They had parts of Spain and Portugal. They had parts of Central America and South America. They had Ireland and England and 10 different kings. I listed 10 different kings in the Genesis 6 conspiracy. And this was the time when the angels walked with humans and created offspring with humans, because Poseidon was a god who took, I think it's Clyto, or is it Clymene? I sometimes get them mixed up because Iapetus has the same mythologies, and I think it's Clyto with Poseidon and Clymene with Iapetus, but it's the same story that's being told that creates these 10 kings. So it's a demigod race offspring of a god and a human female, as it's understood in ancient times in polytheism, that creates these 10 kings that are trying to create a world government by force. It's a beast kingdom before the flood. And it's really interesting that the 10 kings of the end time is the same number.
Yeah, the toes.
And Francis Bacon wrote the book The New Atlantis, where you have a universal religion that works in perfect harmony with science, that works in conjunction with the rulers of the end time, is the new age that they're trying to bring about for a counterfeit millennium.
I almost made another connection there with the toes are destroyed by the stone that becomes the single mountain that fills the earth. So I almost wonder if that's symbolic also of the unicorn, the one mountain that destroys the others. Just made me think of that. That's so fascinating.
I think though that's more referring to Jesus that's going to be doing that, but I'd have to double check that. But well, it's interesting. I'll have to look at that in terms of how you're looking at that. So, but certainly there's a rock that comes and destroys it. Yeah.
Well, as if they were maybe trying to usurp that, because the Antichrist is a copy after all. So they want to imitate him.
What's interesting though is about the 10 toes or the 10 kings or the 10 horns, as in Revelation 17, is they hand their power over to the Antichrist as opposed to being destroyed by Antichrist.
There are 3, however, that are destroyed, correct?
There are 3, as Daniel talks about, that will be overthrown. And then he distributes their plunder amongst the rest. So I'm thinking it's the 3 richest ones, probably what's left over of our Western democracies, that will be usurped because they may stand against the Antichrist. And but anyways, you are correct. It says 3 of them will be uprooted.
That's really interesting. So is it that maybe they have their own agenda, or is like some competing bloodlines, or they don't
definitely
agree?
Competing bloodlines. Definitely the competing bloodlines. Absolutely.
It's like he's making an example out of them or something.
Yes, absolutely. And when we look at the bloodlines, I mean, there are, and we're told in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 in the epistles of John that there'll be multiple antichrists in the end time. And that these bloodlines, they're all over the world. They're not just European bloodlines. So you can imagine like the president of China, President Xi Jinping, and the XI on there is the shortened form of XIA for the Shah. And the Shah dynasty is basically the Li family, as it comes out of all the dynastic kingdoms of China that go back to the dragon creator gods. And so that's a bloodline that continues to run China. They were overthrown obviously by the communists, but there were Lis involved on communist China, and Shah is more the western part of the Li dynasty as it comes down through their history, and that's going to be a competing bloodline. The Sanim of the East, as they're called in the Bible, the kings of the East, and you've got bloodlines whether or not that still survive in South America and Central America. You've got the Inga Roca of South America. And several bloodlines that remain from the Aztecs and the Quiché Maya, and they weren't wiped out. What happened by about 1525 is that their families were reinstated with all the rights they had before as a vassal kingdom, and then they started to intermarry with the Europeans, with the Portuguese and the Spanish bloodlines. And that only the king that was ruling at the time was killed at that time, but the royal family survived. And so you've got bloodlines all around the world. You've got Putin, whose name is a mystery because it comes out of nowhere in about 1850 with his grandfather. And there's no history in Russia for the name Putin, but there is for the Putyanin in the Ukraine, which is where Putin's grandfather is from.
Mm.
And the Putyanin were the original czars and the royal bloodline of of Ukraine, and then it was moved over to Meshek or Moscow, and the Romanovs usurped that bloodline, but it continued still in the Ukraine. And what's interesting about what they did in Russia in their culture, when the royals had offspring outside the legitimate marriage, they would not provide the full name to the bastard offspring, but they would give part of the name. And so Putin is part of that Putyanin, and why, he was able to work through the government and work himself through, not as a pureblood, but as a partly pureblood. And I think that might be what we have that goes on in the end time with the 10 toes or the 10 kings, is that you have some that are kind of like strongmen and not totally pureblood, but other ones that are complete purebloods that are part of that mix. But what's
like
also in
their pedigree, if you will, right?
It's, yes, where they fit. And so when you look at what's going on with China today, and you look at what's going on in Russia today, they're trying to establish their control over more of their ancient power, right? And certainly Putin has a very sort of intimate connection to want to take the Ukraine back, because that would be the land of his forefathers. And so they're going to create their spheres of influence. And I think we're going to see that happen, sooner than later. I don't think we'll see anything before the Olympics, but I would think that you're going to see Russia move in on the Ukraine before the end of the year, and we'll continue to push. And I think you'll see, China start to take places like Taiwan and build that sphere of influence for those 10 groups of nations that are going to be part of that 10 king empire of the end time.
I found a couple links here that mention China, chapter 73, Secret Societies in the New Age of Atlantis. I shared that in the chat and then chapter 98, the Chem of Mendes. I sometimes see the goat of Mendes mentioned in that kind of phrase there too.
Well, the Chem,
so I shared those for you.
Yeah, I mean, Chem is an interesting word, and as I talk about in the book, is you have Ham that's sort of usurped by the occultists as being one of their great post-Diluvian patriarchs, and Chem is as the Coptic Egyptians spell it, can be Khem or Kham, and Ham is spelled in Hebrew as Cham, and so you get that Chem of Mendes, and the Chem of Mendes was a place in Egypt, and it's got to do with alchemy. That's black, and Chem means I think Chem also means black, and goat is also associated with it. So the goat can be associated with Satan, or it can be associated with Azazel, which is the Chem of Mendes, and it's just an amazing sort of etymological and historical occultic research that you see all of these sort of allegories that just sort of continue to wrap around it. And Azazel is, he's the seraphim who is the leader of the fallen angels in the book of Enoch, who's in the abyss today as that leader. And Azazel is the word for scapegoat for the second goat that's sacrificed on the Day of Atonement that you don't get a reason for. The first one is for the sins of the Israelites, and this one is sent to the wilderness to be sacrificed. And it shows up in the King James Version Bible as scapegoat, but the Hebrew word is Azazel.
I was just
We have
reading
a
this here.
sorry.
Why is the good of Mendes clearly associated with Rosicrucian and alchemy? Perhaps the Geborum process that Nimrod through was to somehow wed himself with these kingdoms, or one of these kingdoms anyway, to establish some type of rulership through that spiritual hierarchy. It shows here a snake maybe eating this person and then being bound with a rope in the picture here. It's just one way of me
Well,
trying to
yeah,
figure it out.
is that rope sort of in like a transposed S or a Z?
Yes, exactly.
That's the allegory for Azazel. So in Rosslyn Chapel, he's hung upside down with that rope leading away in that sort of format, and he also has the pearls of wisdom because he's the one who gave the knowledge. That's the allegory for pearls of wisdom. And yeah, so Azazel is he is. I mean, he was probably a seraphim angel, and was degraded to that sort of goat god sort of status. And it's also interesting that you get these satyr goat gods that show up after the flood. That I think they're probably degraded fallen angels, probably seraphim angels,
Like
and
Pan,
like Pan, like
Yeah.
Bacchus, like Cernunnos, like Cern in the Etruscan pantheon.
Oh, wow. So do you think that this could be one reason why we're taught to ye shall know them by their fruits? We always test it back to where they came from because, for instance, if they came from Azazel, they're going to have goat-like, origins, right?
Yep. Yep.
So that's really fascinating when you think of the animals themselves like trees almost.
Yep. Yep.
I have to butt in.
Sorry, go ahead.
I have to butt in because we had a question and it's not related exactly, or maybe it's all related. But Chris D wanted to ask you if you think there's a scripture to show that the earth is hollow.
Well, I think there is. I think we want to be careful with it as to what it means, but there's a lot of passages that talks about in the earth, right? And beings being in the earth. So in the earth is the place of the abyss, biblically, and the underworld. And hell is made up of three parts, as it's conflated into one word in the Bible. Hell is the lake of fire. That's in a different location. Hell is also Sheol, or Hades, as we would know it, as the underworld, the netherworld, and when it's got many different names, otherworld. And it's also is the place where the abyss is located, and the abyss is the pit or the prison or the bottomless pit, as it's also described, that the fallen angels are locked into, who committed crimes against humanity and against creation, both before and after the flood, if there was a second incursion in it, and I think there was. And it's also in the cells of along the sides of the abyss are where the worst of the terrible ones are, the worst of the Nephilim and the Rephaim, the ones that are also talked about in Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 25 and Ezekiel 32. Terrible ones is one of those terms that people tend to overlook. They're talking about the worst of the Rephaim kings and warriors who did terrible things on earth and were slain. These are the ones that are talking to Pharaoh in Ezekiel 32 from the abyss. And so, yeah, I think I kind of lost my train of thought there on that last rabbit trail, but
inner earth, hollow
inner earth,
type thing.
yeah. I mean, so, but we also need to, I think, sort of understand that when we're talking about in the earth, that it could be in a different dimension, and it probably is. So we'll see some underground cities, whether or not it's Göbekli or however that's pronounced, or other underground cities that are around. Petra is supposed to be like, more than 2/3 of it is underground. I think there was a lot of that went on, and there could be some subterranean places where people escaped to. Some people theorize about escaping the flood there. It's a possibility. I'm not sure how they would have got air, but somehow, some way. But what we do know is that we get scripture that talks about being in the earth, and that we do know there's the underworld. We know biblically a Sheol, and we know that there's the abyss, but I think that's more into a different dimension. And so that would be portals that would be used to get there. You know, just as the Raphael of the Ugarit, the Rephaim, went back between the underworld and the earth through these portals. And Gilgal Rephaim has a lot of dolmens, over 100 dolmens, and dolmen means portal as you translate that out. So yeah, I think we need to understand that concept, but I think we need to be careful with it, that it may not be quite as literal as some people sort of understand it.
That was a good answer. Thank you.
Okay.
You mentioned dolmen here. I have shared a link here about dolmens.
It is 6:15, and it's not
Yeah,
that
they're like a mini Stonehenge type thing. I don't have the picture up, but they're like a mini Stonehenge figure. And just as a Stonehenge is thought to be a portal as well, or many portals there.
What did you say, Aaron?
Oh,
Something about the time.
Yeah, I said it is 6:15. Did you? I don't want to stop before we don't. If you had more questions, though, NPC, I want you to ask them.
I had two more topics. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, before we moved off the dolmen thing, so as these are megaliths, were these actually built by the men of renown and the giants for the purposes of being a portal in some way, shape, or form, you think?
Oh, I think so.
They look
I think
huge.
so. Yeah, they're huge. And you know, these types of portals, they don't have a lot of sophistication to them, right? Other than it takes a lot of sophistication to put them together in terms of the technology. So yeah, I think the Nephilim before the flood had a lot to do with that, and then I think the Rephaim would have been active in that again after the flood, and I think that was also a combination of being able to build the things that they did came from the knowledge that was developed from the 7 sacred sciences that wedded with the knowledge that came from Azazel and the other fallen angels, or as in the other cultures around the world would understand it, the knowledge that came from the gods to start civilization.
Okay, so thank you. Well, I guess this kind of connects. So one of the other things I wanted to ask was about how Odin and Gwen ap Nud, you mentioned Gwendolyn earlier, so it made me think of Gwen and maybe how he's related to her. Perhaps you said there was a king and a queen. It says here that Gwen ap Nud was like a king of the fairy folk.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, how does this relate to the Fomorians and the giants and the Tuatha De Danann? Are the fairies like something altogether different, or maybe are they being recast in this different sort of way?
Well, you've got 4 different kinds of fairies. You have, in the fairy culture, you have the ones who come from another planet, as they like to recall it, with wings and are the proud ones. These are the fallen angels. They have offspring, which are the Tuatha De Danann. They are the fairy people, the fair people. And then you have the demonic spirits that we talked about, like the banshee and spirits that we talked about throughout the show. And then you have the elementals, which are the little people, and they're at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so you've got 3 that I talk about in the book, which are the good-looking ones. You've got leprechauns, which are, part of the mischievous ones, and then you've got the ugly ones like the gnomes and the hobbits and the dwarves and things like that. And they all had roles and specific functions in the occult organizational structure. And then the 4th one, which I don't talk about in the book, they are the reptilian ones. Those are the salamanders. They're larger than the elementals. And we get elemental in the New Testament, and also look for rudiments as well. And so you're going to get some applications where elements are talked about, the elements of the earth and things like that, but also as elements as in ruling and in part of the organizational structure. And the elementals were at the bottom of the organizational structure. So when we look at understanding of that, let's look at the Tuatha De Danann, where this starts to kind of intersect in what you're talking about, who, after the flood, they come from Scythia. And you have different kinds of Tuatha De Danann. They have red hair and hazel eyes, which are the ones that are predominantly for the Irish and the ones in Wales and Scotland. And you also have, and that's also the same color as the Rephaim, hair color and eye color, that go down into the Middle East. And that's why I think they're the Rephaim after the flood. Just as a Horim, you also take that back to a pale white in its etymology in terms of Hebrew. And again, I've got all of this information in the new book that's coming out. And you also have blonde hair and blue-eyed ones that went up the Danube River and settled into Romania, the Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and into Scandinavia. And so you have a very strong fairy tradition there as well. And again, when you sort of connect back that King Arthur tale that I was talking about earlier, with the Knights of the Round Table as sort of an allegory for the Lord of the Rings or the Ring Lords of Sumeria, you have these knights who are actually kings. And Gawain is the son of a king out of Norway, in Lot, Norway, as the allegory goes, which is a different rabbit hole I won't go down right now. So when you talk about the fairy understanding and the gods of Odin, I mean, Odin is, like he's like Osiris, or he's like Zeus, like he's the chief god of the pantheon after the flood. But we're talking about the same pantheon around the world, and we're talking about a different branch of the same people, just with a little bit more of a Nordic sort of flair to it as it comes out of the Nordic and Germanic countries. And so when you look at the fairy tradition as is seen in The Lord of the Rings, that is Tolkien's Nordic version of the fairy mythos, from the small ones to what would be the white elves, which are a different classification, and they are tall ones as they are depicted in The Lord of the Rings, with blonde hair and blue eyes. And now take that back over to the Tuatha De Danann over in Ireland. And there's a famous painting where you can see some of this stuff depicted that's called the Riders of the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E, which is also a word for portal, as well as the Sidhe people. These are the Tuatha De Danann, and they're shown riding these white Nephilim horses type of thing with these horns, a unicorn, as it was understood as a physical being created on earth before the flood, a chimera type of being. And you have the Tuatha De Danann that are these white elves that are shown in The Lord of the Rings riding them, and that's the Tuatha De Danann of Ireland. And they got all of these sort of snake sort of imageries on it. And it's the same branch. It's a different branch of the same people and slightly different sort of local vernacular flavors to it.
I got a picture of it up right now. There's one man wearing a serpent on his, or a lady rather, wearing a serpent on her crown. Another one holding the cup of the Dagda, the sword of irresistible force. I don't see the spear, but they had the stone of destiny, the cup, the sword, and the spear. Yeah,
they got a lot of stuff in there. And what's also interesting is that the Egyptian pharaohs had that sort of snake-like thing all in around on their imagery as being the pharaoh kings or the fairy kings. They're also connected in there.
Oh, Pharaoh and Fairy do sound a
Yep.
lot alike. That's pretty funny. Wow. Well, yeah. Oh, and can you maybe comment on Odin? Because he seems like a really mysterious figure, and it's kind of hard to know like which side he's on. Because again, if we go back to Zechariah 11:17, it talks about the one eye symbolism, and I did some research to see if I could figure out which eye he had actually given up, and I found a myth with him and a giant where he plays a game with the giant for their heads, which is kind of like the Green Knight game too, I noticed. But he finds out that he has to give up his right eye, and so I think that's kind of interesting that we're told in particular in Zechariah 11:17 that it's the dark eye, or the right eye rather, that's darkened. So it almost suggests that Odin's part of this left-hand shepherd king path.
Well, but he's the parent god. So as I sort of understand the allegory, is that's like creating the Cyclop race out of the Norse mythology, and that leaves him with the all-seeing eye allegory as a god.
Okay, that's really wonderful. Thank you. And I was wondering too, it seems like he's always trying to prevent Ragnarok, which is known as Twilight of the Gods, little g, I would assume. And so it's like they're trying to stop their inevitable judgment, kind of like we read about in Enoch, where they're reserved for judgment and stuff. So it's almost like he's trying to change the fate.
They are, and that's all they have left to do, is the ones that aren't in the abyss, is to stop or try and change the times, but they're going to fail, because until the end time can't come until the restrainer comes. But they'll accept the end times because they want to reap as much destruction on earth as possible and destroy as many humans and lead as many people astray as possible. They certainly, at the time, before Jesus came, I mean, they probably still thought they had a chance to justify their rebellion and to live in a realm away from God on their own. But they did not anticipate the resurrection. And if they had, they certainly wouldn't have ensured Jesus was crucified.
Well, and it's
as Corinthians talks about,
because one other connection I made was that the term Quinaral, spear bearer, which is one of the 7 hills outside Rome, I've made the connection that Odin was also a spear bearer, and they pierced Christ while he was on the cross with a spear. And who was it? Of course, a Roman legion member. Yeah. So I never had seen this before. I pulled up this page here on Odin, and it says Wodenats can mean Lord of Frenzy or Leader of the Possessed, which I'd never seen it. So maybe when this one-eye symbolism, they're possessed.
Yeah, and just as Satan, as Diablos, is the prince of the demons, so is he.
Man, well, okay. Thanks, Aaron. I just wanted to squeeze those couple last things in about Gwen Apnud and Odin. Seems like their role is to basically lead humans into captivity or something.
I wanted to ask Gary one more question that comes from the chat. If you wouldn't mind, I'm sure you got a good answer for this. And Sophia asks, how do we find out what bloodline we are from? I believe we are grafted into Jesus's bloodline, but sometimes I wonder.
Well, the first thing the Bible tells us about is not to be taken away with genealogies and things like that. So, in terms of our bloodlines, your physical bloodline isn't really important unless you're part of Israel. They have a separate destiny, and they will be, they'll have their destiny fulfilled in the end time, and specifically, at the time of Ezekiel 37, just before the second Exodus, where you have a resurrection of Israel's dead. And they're going to be brought back into the covenant. For us, we're grafted in, as we're talked about in Romans, into that covenant and into that vine. And it's our faith in God and Jesus that determines whether or not we're going to be saved or not. but not our Gentile bloodlines if we're Gentile. But I would also say to people that lost Israel has not been awakened. So people may be awakening in not so distant future, called by name in the end time, perhaps even during the time of the 144,000 that go out to preach, that are going to understand who they are as the lost tribes in the last 7 years. And I think that's going to be another interesting time in terms of bloodlines. But from a Christian perspective, as a Gentile, as probably most of us are, then it really, bloodlines don't really matter.
Agree. And I know I've heard you say that. I think long before you knew who I was listening to you with a guy that said something about, I think he had 6 vertebrae and he was concerned about RH negative. And you had a great answer back then too, that there's certainly salvation even if you've got the 6th vertebrae or the 6th finger or an RH negative bloodline.
Yes, your physical attributes don't determine salvation. And even with the people of Israel, they're going to be judged. Some to everlasting life, some not, as Daniel 12 talks about. So it's about your faith, your belief in God, your belief in Jesus, and the things you do.
Thank you for your time, and thank you. I know that you do run into technical issues for some reason a lot, but I appreciate your patience regardless. So I felt a lot better, and I wasn't quite as stressed out knowing that this isn't the first time you've had technical issues. And thanks to everybody in the chat who came back. A lot of people came back, if not more than were there before. So maybe it worked out somehow for the better.
Terrific.
I want people to remember to go to Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's in the description box. It's also pinned in the chat, and you can get the current book. And you said the next book will be coming about when?
Hopefully by mid-year. I've still got chapters to write, but I'm spending a lot of time every day on it. So yeah, I want to have it out. It's a matter of where I end up with publishing. I've got some options in front of me. I just want to make sure that we get it out for a reasonable price and it's got good distribution.
And a huge thanks to NPC who kept the screen going. He dropped a lot of links for different chapters of your book and also different subjects. He is much more the researcher brain like you than I am, so I'm grateful he's here to help with that. You've just been a huge benefit to me. So thanks for that. And Gary, would you mind closing us out in prayer, and then I'll finish us off with a song, and I'll let you guys go.
Sure. Father in heaven, we thank you for permitting us and to be able to get together, to be able to talk about things and have the time to talk about things and just commune together in trying to understand who you are, who we are, what's really going on, and to learn more about the word that you have presented us and to bring us to Jesus and to really understand the blessings that you have provided for us in terms of the roadmap to what is going on in this world and what I think maybe the fig tree generation that we're in today and how to prepare for that. And so I pray that we're able to communicate that clearly and raise some curiosity and to hopefully have people dig deeper into the Bible, because every detail in the Bible is important and has meaning, and that they can take that and communicate it to others so that they can start to recognize what really goes on in this world, what has happened, and what is going to happen. And so I pray that you bless all of those who have been listening and can carry on some of the information as they seem fit, and that we were able to clearly communicate the information and glorify the word that you gave us. And we pray these things in the name of our Savior, the word Jesus, who sits at your right-hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints. And we also pray in the name of the Holy Spirit in your great and holy name. Amen.
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 Thank you
Gary.
for that powerful prayer. And thank you again to both of you. I hope you have a blessed night and a great Saturday. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Pleasure. Thank you again for sharing time with me.
Good night.
Yo, it's a mad, mad world. Crazy, evil intentions. Technology, real evil inventions. Pills that kill kids while in the womb of the uterus become headstone and tomb. Poison filled beef and water fluoride. Can't eat, afraid of what they put inside it. Chemtrails poison the air that we breathe in. So big it's all for anyone to believe in. Innocence wiped from the face of the earth. More U.S. soldiers buried in the dirt. President says, good job, stay the course. Take a look at his face, he doesn't have no remorse. Secret meetings in the midnight hour. Look past the president, find real power. False propaganda, all for your vote. Orders come down from the Antichrist Pope. Best stay in line or we'll have your head. That's just what the tyrant president said. We'll tell you how to raise your family right. Then snatch you right out of your house late at night. The goal of the evil man is straight control of your mind, body, eventually your soul. You gotta stand up, it's time to be bold. Stop listening to everything you're told. We got wars, pandemic, 10 city zones. Government betrays its own, you're not alone, cuz. Always a hero comes home. We got wars, pandemic, 10 city zones. Government betrays its own, you're not alone, cuz. Always a hero comes home. As I look to the east, right at the horizon, keeps getting brighter cause the sun is shining. New day still alive, so I'm fighting. Thoughts go into every song I'm writing. 7 billion people on earth, we motivated to take back the whole world that God created. Reinstate all the rights that he gave in. Break out the chains cause I ain't no slave, man. Open up your eyes, look at all the hate. Better wake up real soon before it's too late. Signs all around, see the works of Satan. Total mass destruction of God's creation. True warrior right on the front line and a vow to protect everything that's mine. Wanna see the future, just press rewind. Investigate everything you find. We got wars, pandemic, 10 city zones. Government betrays its own, you're not alone, cuz. Always a hero comes home. We got wars, pandemic, 10 city zones. Government betrays its own, you're not alone, cuz. Always a hero comes home. Burying field air, unfit breathing. Bird flu, swine flu, I'm not believing. Man-made pandemic in laboratories. Media outlets tell false stories. Evil man has a plan G population. White, Puerto Rican, black, Indian, Haitian. Plan is to split up America in zones. New constitution, Georgia got stones. We got biblical prophecies, truth being told throughout the whole Bible without a doubt. Some symbolism broke down reveals real devil. My thought process is taken to another level. The beast that sits way up on 7 hills. No remorse for the many heretics it kills. Torturing many millions more at will. Floods rivers with all the Christian blood is spilled. Shocking all bombs, blow up civilians. False prophets, shape-shifting reptilians. New age teachings, rhythm and tones. Freemasons, secrecy, skull and bones. 2012 spread like false propaganda. Kill children, but save the wild panda. Values twisted, morals deleted. Last days coming, Satan's finally defeated. We got wars,